Welcome everyone for this event titled Governance That Centers Communities, Lessons from Afghanistan and Sierra Leone. This event is co-hosted by Catalyst for Peace and the Institute for State Effectiveness, as well as the Permanent Mission of Afghanistan and the Government of Sierra Leone. So welcome everybody, and a big thanks to all our partners. We have a great speaker lineup for you today, this morning. And as I was reflecting on what's the nutshell of this event is, we rarely hear examples that are working on inclusive and people-centered governance approaches. We ask for these inclusive and leave no one behind frameworks that center on community, both as the heart of the 2030 agenda, in the Sustaining Peace resolutions. So at the global policy level, we know that this is our aspiration, but we rarely lack examples on the field of how you transform these aspirations into reality. And of course, the local level is a lot more complicated than these aspirations. When you get to work and you roll your sleeves, it's not as lofty. But we do today have the unique opportunity to learn and to share from two very concrete examples from very different parts of the world, from Sierra Leone and Afghanistan, of people that are making this happen. Of course, they're not perfect, but they are working examples that we can learn, that we can draw on. You know, most of the times the local level don't get the headline. These type of initiatives don't get to be in the press or like be in the limelight. So we really do want to highlight these events for all of us to learn, to share, and to perhaps implement a new way of designing peace and development strategies at the national level, learning from these locally led, community-led examples. So we are very delighted that for opening remarks, we will hear from Minister Francess Piagie Alghali from Sierra Leone, and then from Ambassador Adela from the Permanent Representative of Afghanistan in New York. Ambassador Alghali, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jimena. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I am very pleased to be part of this high-level event on governance that centers around communities, that centers communities, what is working in Afghanistan and Sierra Leone. I must say, coming from a country that had civil conflict, Sierra Leone has been relatively peaceful since 2002. However, that is not to say that there haven't been incidents of violence or conflict. But these incidents have largely occurred during elections or as a result of resources. And we have been able to identify some of these drivers that lead to the conflicts. And one of them is the lack of inclusive dialogue platforms at the community level and the lack of participation. People feel that they don't belong to these communities when they lose livelihoods and there is nowhere where they address some of these issues. Then the next thing that they do is violence. So as a government, we believe that in order to avert some of these violent incidences is to strengthen the decentralization process and strengthen local government as a way of addressing some of these issues. And this process is being supervised by my office under the Office of the Vice President. As a government, we believe that local councils, local governments know and understand their communities better, and they are well placed to implement initiatives to build social cohesion and to reap the resulting benefits of stronger, more resilient and productive communities. Therefore, establishing and enhancing community governance structures is the way forward to improve the livelihoods of communities. The government of Sierra Leone, in 2018, we identified one model, which is the People's Planning Model. We call it now the One Fambul Framework, as a critical rural development instrument not only for economic development, but also to build peace, social cohesion, and inclusion. It's a unique model. It sparks, how can I say, it sparks the imagination of communities. It makes the communities feel that they are part of the development. It engenders leadership and inclusivity. And one unique component of this framework is that it gives prominence to women and former groups that have not been included in the conversation in the communities, like disabled people, like youths. Those people now feel that they have a say in the way their communities is being run. And these community structures that we have developed using the One Fambul framework have been used to address current issues that are facing our country. For example, we use these frameworks to address the Ebola pandemic that we recently went through. We use these frameworks to address natural disasters. We are using this framework to address the COVID pandemic now in unique and innovative ways. For example, spreading the message of hand washing, spreading the message of social gatherings. These are the structures, these are the governance structures that we use, and they have worked quite well. This model originated, of course, from collaboration between international and the national. And as a government, we found ourselves in the middle of this partnership, and we adopted it and we held it with two hands. Recently, the Interministerial Committee on Local Government, which is headed by the Honorable Vice President in Sierra Leone, puts the One Fambul, or the People's Planning process, in the local government policy. And as part of the local government policy, it's going to be enacted as the legislative framework for local government. So that is the way we have moved. And we think that once this is legislated, then it makes any government that comes into power obliged to follow this framework. It would also mean that it will be part of the budget allocation for the government. As a country, we believe that the first step in achieving the SDGs by 2030 is for us to be able to sustain peace and national cohesion, which is the bedrock of any form of development. Without peace, without cohesion, there is not going to be development. And in order to do that, we have to strengthen governance at the community level by putting communities at the center of planning and development process. This is what we have done in Sierra Leone as a model by incorporating the One Fambul National Development Framework in our governance and structure. And we hope that other countries will emulate this good example. I thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your comments and for bringing the idea that the One Fambul talk sparked the imagination and really inspired people to join. And in our panel session, all of you and our audience will learn more about the story of One Fambul talk and what it is and why it's so innovative. Thank you. Next, we turn to Ambassador Adela. You have the floor.
Thank you. I thank, first of all, Catalyst for Peace, the Institute for State Effectiveness, and the International Peace Institute for organizing this discussion. I also want to recognize Minister Alghali and our distinguished panel who would be speaking for the wealth of experience that you all bring today to the conversation. Community-led initiatives are an effective alternatives to the classical top-down models of development. These initiatives unite citizens to mobilize resources and collectively define and implement projects that provide public goods and services for their communities. The success of community-led initiatives teaches us that government programs are most effective when working directly with citizens, and highlights the importance of empowering people to be partners in the development field. The implementation of these initiatives has been instrumental in Afghanistan's development gains. Since the restoration of the Republic, the government has prioritized people-centric programs that reflect the needs on the ground. Notably, the National Solidarity Program and its successor, the Citizens Charter, have empowered Afghan communities to identify, plan, manage, and monitor development projects. The NSP promoted the democratization of projects through a process in which locally elected community development councils are identified, priority sub-projects, and applied to receive funding for their implementation. The program's success was evident to its very positive impact in over 35,000 communities, which included greater access to public services and an overall acceptance of the democratic process and people-centered approaches. Lessons learned from this initiative led to the implementation of the new Citizens Charter program in 2016. This program deepened the relationship between the government and its citizens and expanded the responsibility of the Community Development Council through an interministerial collaboration for better citizen-centric delivery of services, including universal access to clean drinking water, quality education, health services, and infrastructure. Over 13,000 communities have been reached by the program so far, and translating into 12,800 completed projects, and more than 13 million people have been benefited. The objective of this project was to connect the government, the center of the government, which is usually the way our institution or structure, it's basically a lot located in Kabul, in the capital. And there was an absence of reach out to the local areas, to the provinces. So the objective of this program was to really make sure that government institutions are also able to respond to the needs of provinces, and also not only responding to the needs, but engaging the communities as well through government-led initiatives in the development field. The government also has taken a community-led approach to the SDGs. Since the adoption of the 2030 Agenda, the government has worked to nationalize the SDGs by identifying the most relevant targets and indicators to develop the Afghanistan Sustainable Development Goals. Through the implementation of these SDGs, which is the Afghanistan Sustainable Development Goals, we wanted to bring the needs and priorities of the people of Afghanistan front and center, and as part of a document that outlines our development priorities for our national institutions, our donors, and the key stakeholders in the process. Through this, we also wanted to assert the vision of our citizens as partners in the development and for the achievement of the 2030 Agenda as part of our project as well, an objective to leave no one behind. Of course, in Afghanistan, when we are talking about community-led efforts, we cannot discuss this without the element of peace. The government has also emphasized that Afghans from all segments of the society should have a say in the peace process. Key to this was in 2009 in April, there was about 3,200 delegates from all 34 provinces of the country gathered for Loye Jirga, a format of our Grand Assembly, which concluded with the declaration that that prioritized our objective for peace and the formation of an inclusive negotiating team, the first step forward in the talks. The government has abided by the Jirga's decision and again consulted last August to settle an impressive decision, but a very difficult decision to release the 400 remaining Taliban prisoners as part of the commitment from the government side in order to start the peace talks. The government is also empowering women to engage in track 2 and track 3 peace processes through community-led initiatives. The second phase of our Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan emphasizes the localization of the plan and close consultation with stakeholders around the country. This has led to the development of local action plans, which have strengthened community leadership and further amplified local ownership of the National Action Plan. I share these examples to underscore the impact of community-led initiatives on national processes and how effective they have been in helping Afghanistan regain the trust of our people and the fate and the processes that had been led by the government, and as well in some parts by our partners and donor community too, because that has been our recommendation to them, that if you want to gain the ownership, it has to be with the great engagement of the local communities. We're still in the middle of our journey, but Afghans today feel very strongly and believe that we definitely are able to influence the future of our country. And one of those format that has helped us to maintain the trust is the form of government we have, which is the Islamic Republic, because it truly is a representation from every aspect of our society. Therefore, I believe that this is the environment we should strive for with these important initiatives and building more people-centric governments and processes and initiatives that leads to greater ownership of the local communities. I thank you,
Ambassador. Thank you so much. And in your insights, one of the things that struck me was how you mentioned that this program was able to connect the central government with the local provinces to avoid that gap that is so common in many of our countries. So that's part of building an inclusive governance system. And in our panel, we will hear more about the Citizens Charter program and how it came about and the story behind it. So thank you so much for your time. Now we shift to the panel. This is going to be a Davos-style conversation. It'll be interactive, and colleagues, please, wherever you're listening to, send us your questions. We have a centralized way of looking at the questions, and even if we don't have all the time to answer the questions, they will be part of the summary and of our reflections post-event. So I do invite you to comment and to post questions in the chat for the Q&A session. I've told all our panelists that I'm going to be very strict with time. So when you see the world, it's time for you to wrap up. If you see this polar bear, it's really, I'm going to basically have to interrupt you. So please stick to the time. We do have a super fantastic panel. We have Rasouli, who is the social participatory and development expert and former Director General of the Citizens Charter program. We have John Cocker, Executive Director of Humble Talk International. We have Ms. Libby Hoffman, Founder and President of Catalyst for Peace. And we have Clare Lockhart, Director of Institute for State Effectiveness. So welcome to all our speakers. And we will start this off with a 1-minute question and answer for all our speakers, which is, why is centering communities in peace and development so important? Why would governments want to work towards this kind of partnership with communities? Libby, do you want to start us off?
Sure, I'll unmute myself. Well, when we were talking about the format for this, one of the things that you suggested was pretend you're tweeting. So what would your tweet be? So I decided I would retweet. retweet Audre Lorde, who said, "Without community, there is no liberation." But then I thought retweeting was a bit of a cop-out. So my own tweet would be, whole and healthy communities help us be whole people. And without whole people and whole communities, we can't have a system that is whole and healthy. So we have to both be and support whole people in whole community in order to live out a system that is whole, healthy, and regenerative.
Beautiful. Thank you, Libby. That's wonderful. John, your tweet? Can you unmute yourself?
For me, I think, or I know, communities suffered most during crisis. And naturally, you expect them to be at a driver's seat in terms of finding sustainable peace and development. I'll add a little bit to that. Ownership is very important. For peace to be sustained and development to be sustained, the people need to own it. They need to defend this, their process. And I think that is really crucial. And if you ask me why would government want to work this way, it is just natural. The government is normally at the top. And what the people need, they know what they need and they know what they are going through. So it's important to bridge that gap for communities and the government to work together in order to address the needs of the people and their concerns. So naturally, I just think it is just obvious that communities and government needs to work together to find sustainable peace and development.
Great, thank you. Claire?
Good day. We're in the era of empowered citizens, but also a time when trust of people in their institutions is not always at its strongest. And one of my reflections on why these programs are so important is that to earn trust, you have to give trust. And through these programs, citizens are truly trusted to make their own decisions. I remember once being in a very rural community who'd lost nearly everything in war and displacement. And a group of women had come together and they said, it's not about the money. And they said, don't say that. And I said, I don't have the authority to take the money away. They said, but it's the fact that we're trusted to make our own decisions. And that's what gives not only national ownership, but community ownership and individual dignity.
Thank you so much. Rasoul?
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is a very good question. And that means to me that community is the heart of a society. And if the heart of the society beats well, the rest of the society will enjoy a healthy condition. So for me, out of my experience with the National Solidarity Program and the Citizens Charter, I see that bottom-up community-led development programs ensures inclusion, participation of communities, and ownership, which leads to sustainability in development and also maintains durable peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Minister Alghali?
My granddaughter defined a community very recently to me. She said a community is a group of people living together in one place. But the key word there is together. Government, people, communities, all together. So I believe that if we all work together, putting communities, putting governments, putting people together, then we can move development. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Ras, your 1 minute answer?
I think it's the sustainability and ownership. And if we do want to move towards that for any initiative, any project, any program, it has to be owned and as well its sustainability will be based when we start to engage the communities.
Great, thank you so much. Now we shift to specific questions to our speakers. We will start off the conversation with Rasouli. So Rasoul, can you share with us the story and the impact of Afghanistan Citizens Charter, how it came to be a government program, and how the important linkage was made between community voices and national policy? How is it different than top-down development? Thank you.
Thank you, Jimena. And I take the opportunity to thank Ambassador Adela for shedding the light on the background of the Citizens Charter National Priority Program and as the successor program for the National Solidarity Program. So appreciate it, Ambassador Ross. The background of the program design for the National Citizens Charter Priority Program goes back to the last year of the National Solidarity Implementation Program back in 2014 and 15, when the government leadership, particularly His Excellency President Ashraf Ghani, called for the 5th National Consultative Conference of the Community development councils from all over the country, and representatives from all villages across the country came to Kabul and shared their vision for development of their communities with His Excellency the President and the whole government in Kabul. They also provided their hope and expectations in a way that the government welcomed those visions, hopes, and expectations. And under the instruction of the government leadership, several ministries, including Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development, Independent Directorate for Local Governance, Ministry of Public Health, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Education, under a coordination role of the Ministry of Finance, design the priority program. Now, as Ambassador Ross mentioned, we are present in over 13,000 communities, implementing thousands of projects, and in all these interventions and initiatives, people's voice and people's role are at the center of development. So with that, the program was designed and it became a commitment of the government of Afghanistan to deliver this program to the whole nation within a time frame of 10 years. Now we are in the first phase, and another 2 phases will be the follow-on phases to reach the national coverage, meaning reaching to around 40,000 villages in the country. The objective of the program was to, through pro-poor and participatory approaches, put in place sustainable systems to reduce poverty and bind people to the government. In terms of how different the program, being a bottom-up development program, and what is the difference with the top-down, we have many examples and hundreds or maybe thousands of stories that distinguishes the positive impact of a bottom-up approach. First of all, when it comes to sustainability of development and cost-efficient approaches and efforts, out of our experience of 18 years of implementation of such initiatives, we know that projects implemented, prioritized and implemented by communities, they have longer life and they are more sustainable and they are functioning after many years of completion. There is a sense of ownership and community members protect them. The other example is that community-driven development programs encourage the notion of participation and volunteerism. Through this notion, it is quite feasible to expand the program fast and give more coverage. I'm cautious of the time, thank you. So the bottom-up development gives a way to the citizens monitoring, citizen engagement through different platforms of community participatory monitoring, social audit, scorecards, and a comprehensive grievance redress mechanism linking the beneficiaries at the primary level to the government officials from the local all the way to the national level to register their complaints, and their complaints are ensured to be addressed.
Thank you so much.
With that, I think that would be the summary, that a bottom-up approach matters and people have a significant role in maintaining sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for bringing this very rich example and of how the Citizens Charters program is different and how it's having an impact on people's lives at the very local level. We will have more time to hear from you in the Q&A session. Thank you so much. Next, we turn to Sierra Leone, to John Cocker. For those of you who don't know Fumble Talk, can you tell us briefly about Fumble Talk and the relationship that Fumble Talk has forged with the government to work on the national framework for inclusive governance and local development, and what has been required to forge that relationship? Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. I would say Minister Alghali really touched on what I was going to say, so that has saved me. So thank you very much, Minister Alghali. This just shows the collaboration and partnership that we have enjoyed with the government. Fumble Talk is Creole for family talk. You know, it's a Creole language for family talk. And we coined that as a way for Sierra Leoneans to sit together to discuss what led to the conflict. We went through a brutal conflict, 11 years brutal conflict. So the initial concept was to address the gaps, to work on reconciliation, get the people who suffered during the conflict to sit around to talk what went wrong. We used to be one big family. You know, your mother is my mother, your father is my father, your child is my child. It takes a village to raise a child. But what went wrong? So that was the initial idea why we had Fumble Talk. And as the name implies, it's a national conversation. Let's sit around to talk. So then we went around 6 districts over 4 to 5 years, and then Ebola struck. So when Ebola struck, we realized that it's important to have a trusted relationship, which we have already forged. And because of that trusted relationship, we were able to lead a conversation at the community level in terms of the role of communities in the fight against Ebola. We were able to get the stakeholders to listen to communities, to work with communities. And one tangible outcome on that was the idea to include female staff on the burial teams. When the Ebola started, they were all men. And you know what it means when your mother, your daughter, or your wife dies and they say, don't touch that body, you should wait for others. And sometimes, you know, the way they lie down, you are forced to go there to cover. And that was part of the spread. So that was how we entered the discussion around the fight against Ebola. And we successfully engaged peace mothers because the core of our program is working with women. I will fast forward because of time. I will go to the partnership with the government. I would say it's a mutual partnership. It's more of a mutual interest. Fumble Talk, our focus was let's work with the communities. We don't say bottom up. We say inside out, because we believe the people should not be seen as bottom. I mean, with all due respect to all those out there. The idea is we believe people have their answers. People have answers to their problems, solution to local problems, and that is key. So we don't go to communities to solve their problems. We go to communities to facilitate a conversation. How can you emerge stronger? Knowing that the answers are there. What can we do? So naturally, we became, we were seen as a national organization, and the government became interested. So I approached the government after the elections. I wrote a letter to the vice president, and then we started the conversation. They saw the need that, yes, Fumble Talk have been around and they are a credible organization. So we started that initial conversation at post-election violence to coordinate post-election dialogue. You know, why do we have to fight over elections? Why don't we just sit around and talk? What are the issues? How can we continue as communities? So that was how the partnership started. And gradually, you know, we developed trust. Trust is very important in partnership, not only with the government, but with the people, and of course, our international partners. So the government, we started the conversation, and the government became so keen to learn more. You know, we invited the government to communities, some government reps to communities, to see the work firsthand. And then we had some retreat sessions where we had to discuss how can we incorporate this work with the legal structures. And naturally, now we are at a point, as Minister Alghali has eloquently articulated, the One Family framework is now part of the national structures, and we are working very hard for that to be legislated as an act of parliament. So at this point, I would say we are blessed to have a government that listens, and we are also blessed to have a trusted relationship with communities. It's not over. We still have a long way to go, and we hope we'll continue to enjoy the unique partnership with the government. Working with two ministries supervised by the Office of the Vice President is not easy. There are challenges sometimes, but we are happy that we talk over these issues and we move forward. Great. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you for correcting our terminology, because it is not a top-down or a bottom-up. As you mentioned, it's a systemic approach and inside out. And I know that our next speaker, Leiva Hoffman, will speak about that new approach on governance systems that has also made the Sierra Leone example such a success and such a different from the norm. And it's also great to listen that in order to make these changes, you need a receptive government that is able to listen and that has develops that trust between leaders like yourself and government representatives as well. So thank you so much. Leiva, how can a funding partner support community-centered governance? How can funding enable a partnership rather than outside-in approaches? What are the catalytic actions that governments and donors can take that can shift the current funding system and prioritize community-centered governance? Thank you, Leiva.
Thank you, Jimena, and thank you to all of you. It's great to be a part of the conversation, and I'm really happy to be following and to be building on the wisdom of those who've already spoken. And I'm going to just build on some of the things that John talked about, because we've been working together on the first phase of Fumble Talk, the post-war reconciliation phase, for about 7 years when Ebola struck. And we were in conversation during that time. And John said something as he was observing and being frustrated by the international approach to Ebola response and then recovery, where it was replicating a lot of the patterns of aid that had been problematic in the immediate post-war situation in Sierra Leone. And he said something, and I thought it was so interesting and inspiring that I wrote it down, and it's become a keystone for me. He said, they, meaning referring to the international donors, they think they can just come in and pour resources at the problem to fix it. They don't even see the community that the problem is happening in. And that community is like a bowl, and it's cracked. And if you pour water into a cracked bowl, it just goes right through. And you keep pouring and it only makes the cracks bigger. And that's a concept that we decided to build on, not only to address Ebola response, but to leverage our experience with a community-owned and led reconciliation process to try to shift the conversation of post-Ebola recovery and development, and to use that experience to not only shift the process in Sierra Leone to whatever degree that we could, but to open up our broader international conversation. Fumble Talk, the way Fumble Talk worked in the reconciliation phase wasn't about pouring water into the cup of the community. It was about repairing the cup through a community mobilization and engagement process, so that it could hold the water itself, and then it could generate its own activity and lead in its own development, reconciliation and development. We shifted post-Ebola to a community-led planning process called the People's Planning Process, to invite the communities to lead in how you want to prevent Ebola from happening again, how you want to recover, what you need from others, and how Fumble Talk can walk with them in the process. Mobilize the communities to identify their own needs and their own resources and their own capacities and their own desires. and then built that from the collection of villages to the chiefdom level, which is where the traditional leaders are located, and it's kind of the smallest administrative unit in Sierra Leone, brought together stakeholders at the chiefdom level and repaired the cup of the chiefdom level to contain and support this process in the communities. And then built a process, again, recognizing the role of the district level, which is like states in the United States, brought together not only the local councils, but the government ministries, the NGOs, the international NGOs, local civil society, all with the communities in the middle, who now could identify their own needs, their own resources, wanted to begin to work on their own development projects, and we're doing that already. And bringing an inclusive governance process and establishing that at the district level became the way to mobilize and support that whole initiative moving forward. And so post-Ebola, we did this process of repairing the bowls and building out to the district level in 3 different districts, and then invited the government ministries in to support that that process, and worked with the national government. And at that point, we had not only John used to talk about as a human rights activist, he used to speak for the people. And now he's creating a space for the people to speak for themselves. And that's exactly what this was. It was a space where the local leaders could articulate how they wanted to work inclusively in their districts, how they wanted, the community members could articulate how they wanted to lead their own development process. And it supported and enhanced the government's capacity to fulfill its policies. All of that was supported, obviously, internationally. And so in this system, this is the vision of the international system that has motivated and sort of held the whole process, culminating in the One Fumble National Framework. And you'll see there is no up or down. Depending on where you're located, it's a whole system. And the role of each level outside is to create the space that allows the resources in the level inside to be seen, motivated, magnified, and for the learning from the local to move out and be supported effectively at each level outside. That commitment, so this is what we mean when we say communities in the center, not separated and hierarchical, but all together with distinct roles and responsibilities as part of a larger whole. And one comment just to finish up is that the role working this way requires from funders and policymakers and supporters a commitment to process over time, building inclusive infrastructure that allows decisions to be made at the most local level, and engaging in learning in process and emergent design, so that if truly the community is to lead, you have to be able to adapt and learn as you go, which requires a strong learning and emergent design platform for the whole plan. So that's the Tupperware vision of the whole system that we've experienced in Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Libby. And you are really proposing a new approach that is, it's beautiful to see it, the holistic nature of its framing, and those commitments that you speak about, and principles such as committing to process instead of like short-term results-oriented projects. I know that Catalyst for Peace has been working for Sierra Leone for over 10 years. So it is a partnership that's built over time, over election periods and stuff. So it's truly a unique model, and we want this to become the mainstream model for many development agencies. We feel that the impact would be tremendous if we all think and shift towards this mindset, which is very much aligned to the mindset asked in the 2030 agenda of think of holistic nature rather than in silos. So thank you for providing an answer through Tupperware. We're delighted to hear this metaphor every time. Clare, last but not least, from your experience working with a number of governments that have or are centering communities in development, what does community-centered governance look like, and what does it take? Over to you.
Thank you. I'll start by reiterating some of the principles. And as we've heard now, I think when we hear so much globally about the need for bottom-up development, but I think if we can shift the language to inside out, This will be an important move. But we know that development takes place in the villages and neighborhoods where people live. We hear also a lot about the imperative for scaling up. And we know that projects can't be managed in silos one by one because it's cost prohibitive and it doesn't work. And then we hear a lot about the need for partnership between governments, NGOs, and communities. So what we're talking about today is that the kind of platforms that actually put these principles into action. But they must be so, of course, context specific. So the actual form and the institutional arrangements will vary a lot from case to case. They vary between Afghanistan and Sierra Leone, between Pakistan, between the Philippines, Morocco, and and Colombia, the countries across the world where similar programs exist. I'll just talk about a few characteristics. I think the first is this importance of allocation of roles and responsibilities. And one of the most important principles that we've heard today is that the decision rights or the responsibility, the leadership for planning is vested in the community. And this can sometimes be quite hard for governments to let go, or for NGOs to let go when got used to making the decisions. But it's really that shift about understanding that the community will be making decisions and plans for what happens in their community. But that's not it. Then others have extraordinarily important roles to play. What does the government do? It's standard setter. It builds the policy frameworks. It helps with the coordination of other actors. And then the question about levels and functions. So, for example, in Afghanistan, the National Solidarity Program started really as a partnership between the government at capital city level and the communities. But over time, and as we've heard from Rasoul and Ambassador Raz, over time, and with Citizens Charter, it's also about allocating the responsibilities at the district level, at the province level, and with the line ministries. So how do the verticals and the horizontals work together as a whole system? And again, this can look different in different places. Some of the questions then become, what about in urban areas? And there are these kind of programs. Well, a lot of the community development programs operate in rural areas. There are also versions in urban areas and municipalities. Second is the importance of a single window framework. And that doesn't mean, of course, that the priorities will be the same, quite the reverse in communities across the country. But from the perspective of donors with these often fragmented programs, having a single set of rules for operation and community development can be so crucial. And as we've heard, I think there is quite a problematic issue of some of the donor practices that still persist that I think we've got to take enormously seriously in the 2030 agenda. The third, and we've heard about it today, is the way that the programs are very adaptable and iterative, and can not only be tailored to address the needs of a particular community, but when there's a particular crisis in time. So important to hear about how Fambultok was able to play an important role in the Ebola crisis. In Pakistan, the RSPN program was able to play a role during both the response to the floods and the earthquakes. We see in Afghanistan, the Citizens Charter can play a role in drought, and across the world, community platforms are playing an important role in COVID response. So this question of adaptability over time, but also the space that the programs need over years and decades to evolve. Then finally, maybe I thought I would just touch base on some of the contemporary issues that we see a number of programs addressing. And one of them, and we've heard already, is how to respond to, play a role in response and recovery for COVID. And we're seeing a lot of, because these programs exist in community and can survive lockdown, they're playing a really crucial role at the moment, but also on the impact of climate change and in post-conflict situations for reconciliation. A couple of questions. So a number of questions are facing the challenge or the problem of how do you link to different levels of institutions, the district level, the province level, the municipal level. And so I think there's a lot of important work and thinking and innovation that's needed to get those relationships and those partnerships right. And then also, to what extent can they be a platform for entrepreneurship? And is the role of cooperatives and income generation, these programs are not the same, of course, as microfinance, but is there a space for entrepreneurship and growing local businesses that can be played? And there's a lot of precedents around the world, the Mondragon program in Spain, the Raiffeisen program in Austria and Germany. And then finally, the really importance, and this conversation, I think, is an example of that, is the importance of creating a space for learning across context and deliberation and iterating and adapting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you so much for bringing all those insights that kind of help wrap up our first part of the conversation. Now we move to the Q&A, and we have a number of questions already. We have one from Georges from Fox, who's asking, to what extent are local communities enabled to act through the decentralization of decision-making power and resources? What percentage of resources is allocated this way in Sierra Leone and Afghanistan? And our international aid agencies following the decentralized model too? So basically, it is about, Claire, what you were mentioning about connecting all these different governance levels and how our resources allocated to support the system. Maybe Minister Alghali can shed some light in the Sierra Leonean case.
Strengthening the decentralization process and strengthening local government is very, very expensive. It's very, very expensive. But we know that some of the service delivery is related to different line ministries. So for example, the central government doesn't have like a big basket of funds to say this goes to communities or this goes to local government. It does that through service delivery. For example, an amount is allocated for education service delivery, an amount is allocated for health service delivery, an amount is allocated for the different service deliveries that goes to the community. So basically, this is how the budget is allocated. But we realize that the planning process itself needs funding. For the planning process itself needs funding. And if you don't allocate funding for the planning process, then ultimately you would get all the other service delivery processes wrong. So this time, the government through the Ministry of Finance for the next year's budget has allocated funds for the planning process itself, the people's planning process, so that once we get the planning process right and we know what service delivery that government needs to focus on, then it's very easy to channel funds to that. We are also trying to do like a funding model, funding opportunities for the people's planning process. We are in the early stages of that, but once we have validated that funding model, we would ask all our donor partners, those who are interested in funding projects in Sierra Leone, to use that funding model. We need to force donors to not to come and tell us what they think we should do, but rather listen to us, what we think we need based on what the people have told us they want, and then they can join us, they can support us. It has to be more of a supportive process rather than a dictatorial process.
Right. I mean, I think that's part of the model that we're trying to shift, right? About how the funding system also needs to adapt to this new way of working, which for the funding side has to adopt a more humble role, if I'm hearing you correctly, and listen to the voices at the national and local levels. Libby, you know a great deal about this. Do you want to go next, and then we can ask Rasoul and Adele if they want to jump in? Libby?
Yeah, on that specific question, or?
Yeah, because I think it's at the heart of everything that we do. How do you allocate funding to process and to this model?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key things that we've seen is that, you know, this idea of, it is a mindset shift. If you think that providing aid is providing financial resources and getting them to the community, that is, first of all, a one-way flow, but it also is ignoring the resources that are there. And so when you focus on the process work of repairing the cup, not only then can the communities hold the aid, but what we have found is that they actually become like a well, and that they tap into the reserves of groundwater that are there. Minister Alghali said at the beginning, it sparks the imagination, the One Fumble framework sparks the imagination of the communities. Well, that's actually a huge part of the resource that's there. It's the energy, it's the commitment, the capacity to work together. And once you have that process in place, it mobilizes all sorts of new resources that already exist within the community. But it takes it takes a mindset shift on the funder. To really internalize that you're not bringing in resources from the outside, you're investing in the process that helps people discover the resources that are right there, whether it's in a local community, at a district level, or at a national, at the government level. And you have to commit to holding that space as opposed to pouring in resources that are defined in fairly limited ways. And just to reiterate the point, when you do that, it requires constant tending to the process. And this is the other thing, when you're supporting process, you have to pay attention to what's emerging. And you have to create a capacity to build on and from what's emerging. And that happens through collaborative community learning structures at every level. And so the willingness and commitment to not think of resourcing as being one and done, but to think of it as a process that you're participating in and helping to grow and magnify over time. You have to lengthen a time understanding of the process of resourcing, as well as see the multi-directionality of it.
Right. Thank you so much. Rasoul, from your perspective, how can this model be funding, and what has been the experience with donors on this engagement? And I have a question from Jerome Mellon from UNDPO. And so I'm going to throw this question on top because I think others can also jump in and think about it. Do panelists have examples of how community-centric governance engage with non-state actors, such as security actors at the local level? Thank you. Go ahead, Rasoul.
Thank you, Jimena. In terms of decentralization and power of execution, I would say that in the case of Afghanistan, particularly with the design of the Citizens Charter National Priority Program, the program is gradually transforming, or through a process of evolution, it's becoming a sort of platform than a program. There is a high level of trust built among the donors in terms of the capacity of the program at all levels, from the local all the way to the subnational and national level, and also from the government and general public as a whole. So not only the Citizens Charter program itself per se, but we have the examples of many other sub-programs, including emergency response programs. Right now, the government is trusting the program with implementation of the COVID-19 relief program with a budget of around nearly $280 million. There are other programs of community support projects for transmission line in the corridor of transmission line from Tajikistan to Pakistan. So another component is also becoming part of the program. Creation of jobs through maintenance, cash and construction grants, bilateral, and also through ARTA funding is under implementation right now. irrigation canals construction, rehabilitation, and through different bilateral and interministerial approaches are channeled through the program, particularly through the community development councils. And the community development councils now play an umbrella role for other sectors as well, like health, education, agriculture, youth, women affairs. They have created subcommittees under the community development councils and line ministries. They work through these subcommittees and provide services through this channel. So as I said, a high level of trust from the government as a whole and from donors, from the general public has been created, and a big portion of funds and also execution authority from the planning level all the way to implementation and monitoring and oversight is there on the Citizens Charter National Priority Program.
Great, and that's a very important point that you brought, accountability, right, and oversight, and that builds trust. If you see the results and the accountability there, it just immediately creates a positive virtuous cycle, I think, with donors. And Ambassador Ras, can you say something about how this community-centric governance approach has engaged with security actors and justice actors? Thank you.
Sure. I think before going there, I think there was a very important element to the question, and I was reading it, and it said, you know, because usually the central government is not in favor of authorizing or giving the authority to the local governments to be able to have greater spending or lead the project, especially on the infrastructure side, because it's usually expensive projects. And I think this is really true, but there is what has happened in Afghanistan. I think there is not the bravery, but the essence of this is understood by the leadership, and especially His Excellency the President, because he does come with a very knowledgeable development expertise. And as soon as he arrived in the office, one of the weaknesses he identified in the structure is that the local government and provinces, they need to have the authority to have greater spending, because they have a very short or a very specific amount that they could spend, and the rest they had to bring it to the capital, to Kabul, to the line ministries, and ask for all the paperwork to be able to do that spending, not even themselves, but it would be the line ministries to go back. And there was always this disconnect, because the communities and the local governance in the provinces knew much better than the line ministries in the capital. And every time they will go, either there would be a delay or there was usually the mismatch. So the one brave decision that the government took was to let's fix this and turn it around. And one thing that the government did, and I think it was a really, really brave decision, is that to have identify a specific amount as a development fund, that where these provinces will start to compete for it, and whoever would come with most competitive and good model for spending of a specific amount of infrastructure project, they would be entitled, and they could get that money and start to spending it in provinces. And the whole logic was that they should be able to do more of this work, and also their authority of being able, how much they are able to spend, that bar also increased. So those were the two very important steps along the Citizens Charter that had been a very specifically designed program for that. There's also another important decision that the government took, is that you know, our mayors usually in the provinces, they would come from Kabul being identified and appointed. And there was this whole reform to try to make them come through a competitive electoral process, in a sense that the communities and the provinces and they will get engaged in identifying the right candidate. And I think that also helped the mayors to have more greater responsibility as well, and to the constituents that were in the provinces. So these are the very two important other elements that usually when we talk about Citizens Charter, we don't think of these very difficult political decision, but the really important political decision that the government had taken to bring the reform, as I said, that the provinces needs to be more empowered and not so stuck with line ministries in the capital, which usually that is a greater delay in the implementation. And coming specifically in the security sector, I think we have been pretty good in coming with innovative ideas on how to engage the communities, local communities, being part of the maintaining security within their own provinces. And one of the very recent initiatives that I'm just going to name, it's recently we have heard that our big metropolitan cities have started to be receiving greater attacks by the terrorist groups, and specifically Taliban. And I think one initiative that the security sector has started to take, it's called, remind me, Mr. Rasouli, the name for it. It's community and Ministry of Interior together, they create a coalition, which means in a sense that when local communities identify a threat, they have to respond, or they're informing the Ministry of Interior to respond back. So it's a joint initiative of engaging the community plus the government and the security sector entities together, especially for the national projects, bigger projects that we have, like dams construction, maintaining the security of these important and big projects that's important for the communities. And usually it's the first target by terrorist groups and those who are trying to destabilize the government. So that could be one important element. And I think on the justice sector, I am going to shy away to bring an example, but the NSP itself, I think there is an important essence to that of conflict resolution aspect, and colleagues probably have a really good example, especially Mr. Rasouli, that because that's his field, and I learned so much from him today, that within communities, whenever there would be local conflict, these NSP shuras usually would take the lead to address the local conflicts, and that would be sometimes over water distribution. And so there are these great examples, and I think that we can learn. But the last element, which, I mean, the last part, you also talked how the donor communities are coordinating or responding. I think I'm going to come more as passive in this rather than more encouraged and say, look, there's great work been done. We're still having struggle with our donor community in the ground to follow the same model. A lot of time, I think it's this idea that the design is correct and we should just implement it. And a lot of time when these designs arrive from HQ and it's brought to the capitals and then to the provinces, there is a huge disconnect. And there should be a space for adjustment, and a lot of these adjustment needs to happen when they start to hear what the communities themselves want. And most importantly, I think now the government, especially with the government of Afghanistan, and I hear from Sierra Leone too, we're at the level when we have identified our national priorities really well. So our request is that we need to have them engage with us.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You brought so much more to the conversation. We will continue to think about and reflect. John, there's a question from Paola about how have you been incorporated women in the Ebola crisis? I'm wondering about the difficulties encountered in dealing with the crisis related to the local cultural, social, and religious context beliefs. How were you able to work with this cultural, social, religious context in order to deal effectively with the serious situations posed by Ebola? And I would say now with COVID-19 as well. 2 minutes.
Yes, thank you. It's important to note that we already have a trusted relationship before Ebola struck, and the same with COVID. There is that relationship that was built on. And what we did was to consult with them. What can we do? And the ideas came from them. At some point, the government distributed soap, as part of the frequent hand washing campaign. But then it was realized people were suspicious of the soap distributed by the government during the Ebola. So the peace mother said, well, they would be in position to prepare, to come up with their own soap, stamp their soap, and distribute it among their neighbors. So basically, they led their own campaign. They were able to come up with their soap. They produced locally sanitized soap that they distributed from door to door, mostly within the safety of their communities. And they have posters. You know, it just kickstarts the conversation. When you give someone soap, why are you giving me soap? You know, there is Ebola. We need to wash our hands frequently. So we did not go there to say, do X, Y, Z. They came up with their own approach, and we just accompany them, making sure they observe all the safety measures. And the same for COVID. The same thing. They also produce locally made face masks and soap again and bucket, which they distribute to their communities. You know, saying there is COVID, so we should prevent COVID from coming into our community. So it's more or less, they are taking the lead. We are just accompanying them. And that is the beauty of this program. I also want to give an example of how this program have addressed major issues. In one of the districts, there was tension between the traditional leaders and the council, the district council, you know, over tax. So we were able to facilitate a conversation to say, look, you have to work together. There's a common interest here, because if the council don't have enough tax, then there will be less development in the chiefdoms where the traditional leaders reside. So we were able to come up with an agreement for them to work on a joint revenue mobilization, where they share the tax 60-40 in some districts, and in other districts it's 50-50. So the traditional leaders all came on board to make sure they were able to address their own development needs. And then the local council is also able to address their own development. So more or less, we are just facilitating the conversation, but it's been led by the people, and we are just accompanying.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. Last but not least, Claire, we're running out of time, but I do want to fit this very important question into the conversation. We've heard all the speakers, and all of you come from different layers of governance, thinking of the inside-out approach. From your perspective, what kind of institutional arrangements promote collaboration between these multiple layers of governance? Thank you.
Certainly, and I'll take the opportunity to reiterate what we've heard from Minister Alghali and others about the importance of investment in process, and process not just being an overhead in project management, but really one of the foundational elements which helps to build the platform. The institutional arrangements that can promote collaboration, I think it's so very varied, and again will vary from context to context, but I'll give two examples. One is seeing in different contexts how oftentimes villages or a particular community will identify a challenge that they have that they can't solve by themselves, and will seek to collaborate with neighboring villages. And I've seen this happen, I'm sure many on this call have in various ways. Maybe in one case I saw 87 villages came together because what they wanted to do was collaborate on watershed management. In another case, there was the community council was led by a woman, and she and her neighboring villages identified that maternal mortality was the biggest challenge that they had. So they got together with 37 neighboring villages to build a maternity hospital and advocate for it to be staffed and so on. So that's the sort of clustering of villages. So you get the variable geometry to deal with issue by issue. And then another example is in one country that convened a national convention of communities. So on an annual or biannual basis, the communities would come together for sharing and learning across communities. And this is in a context where sometimes there are divisions based on geography or other cleavages, but seeing villages come together and understand that they had and share techniques for dealing with challenges was another mechanism. And in this, the protagonists or the leaders of the conversation were the village representatives, and the development partners were there to listen. So again, really changing the relationships and culture of learning.
Great, thank you so much. So much of what we've spoken about, it's behavioral change. It's not structural change. It's about promoting a new way of doing and thinking of ourselves in the in the Tupperware system of Libby, right? And as John said, most of us are just facilitators, and understanding how that role sometimes it's about being more hands-off and just seeing what emerges, and how holding that space for things to creatively evolve and allow for that context-specific solutions and innovations to take place. We're so grateful for each of your insights and experience and work. We will have a draft summary of the discussion, and we hope to continue drawing on these lessons so that we can all help shift and transform our peace and sustainable governance system. So on behalf of our partners and IPI, we wish you a great day ahead, and thank you so much for this very insightful conversation.